Hey folks, Steve here with a gameplay video. We're going to be taking a look at a volume in the Great Battles of History series, which I covered recently in an introductory video. We're going to be looking at volume 15, Hoplite or Hoplite, depending on your level of pedantry. I think it should be pronounced Hoplite, but there's a whole argument there, and I'm not going to get into it. Anyhow, we're going to be playing the Battle of Tanagra here, and I'm going to zoom in just so you can see a little bit better. And so this battle is one of the smaller battles that comes with the game. It is not the first battle chronologically in the list of games. I decided to cover this one as the first video for the Great Battles of History for the channel, just because this is a relatively straightforward battle that shouldn't take too long to play through. And what I'm going to do here, when you'll see the video, is that I will stop recording at various points and then just start re-recording or start recording again when I'm ready, and I'll just, in video editing software, smush it all together to a nice little narrative run-through of the battle. So smaller battle. This one it uses a half map. You can see that this map is also used for the Ephesus and Leuctra battles. So in terms of terrain, it is nothing but clear terrain all the way around. So the size of the map is just sort of governing the battlefield coverage area. So this battle was between Sparta and Athens. The Athenians had brought along some soldiers from Argos, and the Spartans had a few from their side, their allies. If I look in the scenario book for this one, this is 457 BCE, so this puts us, I believe, in the First Peloponnesian War. So it kind of makes sense, Athens versus Sparta. This is a battle that the Spartans historically won, though, as you can see on the map, the Spartans are the gray units with their allies in green. In the back there, they're in fewer number than the Athenians and their allies, who are the purple counters down along here. And we'll have to see if the troop quality of the Spartans will make up for the quantitative difference in the forces here. The Athenians are flanked on both sides by, you can see this, the normal size counter. These are Thessalian cavalry, and I'll bring it up to the camera so you can see a little bit. Thessalian cavalry, Thessaly 1, light cavalry. And what happened historically is that these cavalry units left the service of the Athenians and joined the Spartans, though it's unclear if they had a very dramatic effect on the battle, at least that I could find in some of the scenario notation here. Now, the battle does have some special rules governing those Thessalian cavalry. So basically, when certain chits are drawn from the action cup, which I'll talk about here in a second, a certain Spartan chit will allow them to attempt to pull them onto their side. It is based on a die roll, and once they join the Spartans, they can't go back to the Athenians, which can make for kind of an interesting situation if the cavalry switch to the Spartans very early in the battle, and maybe there could be some shenanigans here. So if you're unfamiliar with the Great Battles of History series, a couple of things I should just point out. So by and large, units have a number of attributes on them. So I'll just bring up this Athenian hoplite for a second. So this unit has the number in the center there, the 6, and a gray box. That's the troop quality, so higher is better. I don't think I've seen anything above a 9, but maybe there's a 10 out there somewhere. I guess that'd make it... anyway, so the troop quality number is used for a variety of things. It governs how many hits the unit can take before routing. It also can determine it's sort of like a die roll check. If you roll that number or less in certain situations, you can avoid taking a cohesion hit. And that's what the hits are in this game system. They're not necessarily the loss of men, but the loss of morale to a degree that the unit will eventually rout. So 6 is pretty good. I mean, it's right in the middle, I guess, in terms of the rough values that you'll see. Some units that are not very good will be 4, 3 or 4 or something like that, or 5, 6 is okay, and then you get to the 7 and the 8s, and those are usually much stronger units. 8s are like elite units, and sometimes, I can't remember if I've ever seen a 9, but I think that a 9 might be possible. Very powerful. The number in the bottom right there is the movement factor, and all these big long hoplite phalanxes have a movement of 4, though there are special mechanics in the hoplite game that may mean they move slower or faster than that 4. And then the unit designation of HO states that this is a hoplite unit, and that comes into play when we actually do the shock melee combat calculations. The way that this game system works is that you'll compare the attacker and the defender based on their unit type. So a hoplite might be attacking a medium infantry or a light infantry or a light cavalry or a heavy cavalry, and that will change what column you'll roll on for the combat results. Things like positioning, like attacking the flank or the rear of a unit, will modify the results of the die roll for cohesion hits. So obviously attacking a unit in the flank or in the rear will be very useful. So you can see the sort of facing here is, these units are all facing forward, so the sides of the units and the rear will be, you'd have to be sort of behind the unit for it to be the rear, for you to read it, is kind of one way to look at it. Now, how the game will be won or lost, how the battles go, is that over to the right here, get it in view, we have a route point track. And so as units are routed and eliminated from the game, their value in troop quality, modified by a couple of things, will be route points. So I believe these long phalanx units that I had just shown you on the camera, you double their troop quality number, and that's how many route points will accrue if they are eliminated. So if you remove the one we were just looking at, 2 times 6 is 12, the Athenians would get 12 route points if that unit was routed. And in this case, route points are bad. You don't want route points. You want to make your opponent's route point value increase. And there's by scenario, a number that if a side gets to that number in route points, they lose the battle's over. And in some cases, you'll find that a battle could end up that both sides get route points that exceed that required number for both sides by the end of a turn, where you do that check, and then it's going to depend on who has the most route points over their threshold will determine the victor. Again, some of the weeds of some of the weird cases that could crop up. And so, obviously, in these battles with very large hoplite units, all worth that double value. Even just right here, these 4 Athenian units, if they were all routed, that's 24 route points, so quite a bit to deal with here. How the turns go is that, as opposed to other great battles of history volumes which deal with initiative and turn order in a slightly different manner, the way Hoplite or Hoplite deals with it is that you have, per battle, a certain number of these action chits, which I have right over here. So you can see there's a Spartan Hoplite and a Spartan momentum marker, and there's an Athenian Hoplite and a Athenian momentum marker. Depending on the battle, you might have some that are for either certain sets of formations of units, like all of the cavalry or all of the hoplite infantry. In some of the larger scenarios, they might be some designation like the left, the center, or right, if you're playing the Battle of Plataea, I think it is. And so what will happen is, at the beginning of the battle, either by scenario dictation or via a die roll, some side will have initiative. They'll get to pick one of their markers to use to activate units, and then the rest will go into a cup, and you'll draw the chits from the cup, and once all the chits have been drawn from the cup, you will basically have sort of an end turn recycle before you start anew with initiative and all that other good stuff. Now in this battle, there's very few markers. There's not much to go off of here. So basically, when the hoplite markers are drawn, that just means that that side's hoplite units get to move and fire and attack and all that good stuff. The momentum markers when drawn, can either be used again by the Spartans. This is the special counter that or chit they need to influence the Thessalian cavalry, or you can use your momentum marker to possibly activate units again, though there are some costs to activating units a second time in a turn. So that momentum marker isn't necessarily always very valuable. One of the other things that can happen is that if you're able to successfully trump an opponent's activation chit, that may mean you get to get multiple draws of the momentum marker. Now that probably is more valuable in battles where there are a lot of different action markers and a lot of different units that you may want to be activating. Here it's really straightforward, so I'm not sure that the whole trumping will really matter very much, just because there's only so much that we can really actively be doing on a given turn. Now, one of the things that will happen in the game is that once we've determined who's going first, and I believe by scenario rule the Spartans go first, one of the things we'll have to figure out is what is their choice going to be for activation marker. If they choose the momentum marker, they might try to get those cavalry right away, or they might just pick their hoplites and have them start to advance, or they might even pass and let the Athenians come to them. And this is such a interesting scenario in a way, because it is just a bunch of heavy phalanx units all lined up in a row, and it's just going to matter who's going to go where and who's going to start maneuvering. Now, as opposed to some of the other games in the Great Battles of History series, there's a special rule about how hoplite, phalanxes move. And so this is a little bit different than even the Great Battles of Alexander, that also has hoplite phalanxes in that game. So there's one rule that between these two games, Alexander and Hoplite, are shared, is that once a hoplite phalanx starts moving, there's this Hellenic law of inertia special rule that means basically, once they get going, they have to use all of their movement points in their movement towards an enemy, at least until I think they make first contact with an enemy. So I like to think of this like one of those wind-up car toys that kids play with, where you take a car and you kind of set the wheels on the ground and you pull back on it, and that winds the spring. And then when you let go, the car sort of surges forward. And it's sort of like that, where these guys are all getting ready to go, and once they start moving, they have to go 1, 2, 3, 4 every turn, 1, 2, 3, 4 every turn, until they again get into the enemy's adjacency, and they start fighting on all of that. And so there's sort of limited maneuvering that these units can do, as opposed to maybe some of the other games like Alexander or SPQR, where you can get your units around. They're a little more nimble and maneuverable. Here, it's just a lot of guys with spears fighting each other, and that's kind of the way that the battle goes. Now, one of the things that the developers have done in this game to make that a little more interesting and to provide some variety, and it's supposed to be historical detail, but I guess there's some contention around it, is that in Hoplite, and not in Alexander or any other of the Great Battles of History games, what will happen is that when those Hoplite phalanxes first begin to move, we're going to determine their movement speed. So there are these counters that come with the game. You can sort of see advance, that says run, trot, maybe I have a walk, advance walk. So what will happen is when one begins moving, you roll a die, and that means that they're either, depending on the die roll, they're going to be walking, trotting, or running. If they're trotting, that means their movement speed is only 3, and so they'll move 3 spaces. If they're trotting, then they'll move the 4 movement points that they have on their counter, and if they're running, they'll actually have 5 movement points instead of 4. And the issue is that every time they move those 5 spaces, there's a chance they're going to incur a cohesion hit, because when you're running, it's kind of hard to keep your formation stable. If they come under enemy ranged fire, then you get to re-roll to see if they change their speed to run, to try to avoid that fire and to surge faster. And so what can end up happening, which makes it a little different than, say, like the Alexander game, where your hoplites are probably all going to march in one big line formation. Here, the sort of command and control isn't as nearly as sophisticated, I guess, is one way to look at it, if you believe the historical angle on why the rule is the way that it is. That if this unit, say, is walking, it'll go 1, 2, 3. And if this unit is trotting, 1, 2, 3, 4, and this unit is running, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, now the line is not totally even, and you may end up with units that are going to clash before the rest of the line does. Now, in some ways, that might be a good thing. There's a Theban general who worked that into his strategies, that he set up his units in an echelon formation, right? Sort of like that. But that was a controlled maneuver, or a controlled strategy. Here, it's going to be a little bit of variety in each battle as to how well the line can stay together. And you may even run it into cases where if the units are too far apart, you actually can't get proper command and control going. And the way that kind of works is when you activate that command, what governs whether or not a unit is in command is if it can count the number of hexes to the leader that is for that formation. And I'm going to zoom in here on our happy-go-lucky leader, if it will focus for me, please. There we go. So we have our leader there, and there's a certain extent or limit on how far away units can be from the leader to be in command. But one of the sort of exceptions to that helps in this game is that if your unit is outside of that range of hexes but is adjacent to a unit that is in command, then that command can sort of, carry on by passing along the message they can be in command. Which, for the most part, is going to mean as long as the line isn't too disrupted by the different movement rates, most of the units in that line should be able to stay in command until we get into contact with the enemy. There is sort of one I guess, thing to point out. If you ever end up out of command, what it just means is that you can't go and enter in a melee shot combat with a unit. If you're out of command, the unit is really supposed to be moving to get back into command, but it can still potentially do some missile fire and a couple of other things. It's not totally useless if it's out of command, but it will be better to get a unit back into command. And if a unit's already engaged in melee and it's out of command, it can continue to fight in that melee. So it's not totally a lost cause, and it's not as bad. Again, the command system in this game is just a little bit different than some of the other ones. We're focused on the formation chits being drawn, not necessarily a leader being activated. And so in, say, like the Great Battles of Alexander, leaders are much more important in that game because leaders that are better than other leaders can go before them or cause them to not go at all that turn if you can trump them properly. And then, usually on the Macedonian side, each unit is activated individually by the leader designating which units it's going to activate. So it's a little more granular of command and control, where in this game it really is all about the formations working together, and while the leaders are still important for sure, just how units are activated and how they move is just a little bit different. And if a leader is ever killed, then there's a potential they can be replaced by an under-officer, or maybe in some cases not, in which case command issues become a big problem. Now, I think that's enough intro to things, and we'll get into the battle itself here shortly. Shortly to you, it might be a day or two before I can come back and actually play the battle. But for you, it's just going to be an instant. Probably the only thing I'll point out as I'm talking here and while it's just on my mind is that in the event that the Spartans get those light cavalry, the reality is light cavalry aren't particularly useful in this battle. Even if the Athenians manage to keep a hold of them, they're not going to be terribly effective, and I'll explain why. Because I think I've seen a few times online and on forums and stuff where folks are trying to understand why the light cavalry aren't terribly useful sometimes in these battles. Well, the reality is, the way the combat system works is that if a light cavalry were to attack a hoplite phalanx from the front, and this is, your horses stampeding and charging into a wall of spears, obviously that's pretty bad. I think anyone could surmise that. If you're attacking from the flank or behind these units, so let's say maybe the cavalry do indeed turn to the Spartan side, and you had them turn and come over here, and now they're swinging out behind this hoplite and they're attacking from behind. The reason why that's not going to be terribly effective, from a game mechanic standpoint, is while that unit will have an advantage, an attacker advantage on the unit, which is a game term, which we'll look at in the charts when I'm playing, it does provide an attack superiority bonus. The reality is, if you look at the weapon system chart, that a light cavalry attacking a hoplite phalanx here is very poor, a very poor column on the die roll chart, and you're not going to get very good results, or you're going to get results that are okay, but it's just as likely that those light cavalry are going to be disrupted just as much as they would be, just as much as the hoplites are being disrupted. And the reason for that is you have to keep in mind light cavalry is just that, light cavalry. They don't have the mass of, say, heavy cavalry or Alexander's companions, where they're suited up with a lot of armor and they're really meant to be fighting in this melee combat. Light cavalry typically are more harassers, skirmishers, and pursuers than melee champions, and so they simply aren't going to have very good columns on that die roll modifier. Now, where they might be useful is if that hoplite formation is already engaged by another unit, and so let's say, just for a second, this guy got all the way over here, and they were engaged in combat, and you had the melee shock phase. Well, the hoplites attacking from the front, and the light cavalry attacking from behind, that might be able to provide some benefit to the number of units attacking a unit. So that's another one of the attributes sort of in the combat system, that the number of units is important. And so in that situation, it may be useful to attack, with the cavalry from the flank or from the rear if that unit's already engaged. But the reality is it's just going to be really tough to get into that position. Probably the best way that these cavalry will be used will be to eliminate units that are routing. So once a unit is started routing, it will typically begin to retreat towards the back of the map, wherever their retreat edge is. And while they're routing, they're not eliminated from the game yet. It's possible that they could rally and come back. But if those routed units are attacked and take another cohesion loss, then they're immediately eliminated. And that's sort of, I like to think of that as shattering them, to use a term from a PC game called Total War that you might be familiar with. Shattering them totally and making them immediately taken off the map and inflicting those route points. So, what could happen is if these are turned to the Spartan side, Spartans maybe have them back here, and when this unit is fighting and this unit begins to rout, they just immediately swoop in and eliminate them, so that they don't have any chance of rallying and coming back. So worth calling all of that out just so you can kind of understand the tactics of this time. We're not dealing with, in specifically this game, we're not dealing with very many skirmishers, the low number of skirmishers as compared to the great battles of Alexander or SPQR, and even cavalry are going to be relatively limited in scope, and while there may be some missile cavalry that will be useful, light cavalry that have no missiles like these ones here on the map just are not going to be terribly useful, other than, again, as those pursuers that can make sure that units stay gone. Though I'll also point out for this battle that these hoplite phalanxes kind of have a special rule that during the end phase, after all the chits have been drawn, they immediately disintegrate anyway. So while normal units, single hex units, can keep running and running and running, as long as they don't leave the map, you have the potential to rally them and bring them back after the turn's over, assuming they don't go off the map or totally disintegrate. There's a check for that, but assuming they don't, some units can come back. These hoplite units, the double wide ones, will disintegrate at the end of the turn, and so it's really kind of important that, if you're going to try to rally them, you do it as quickly as possible, and so these cavalry can kind of make sure that there's just never a chance for that to happen. It's going to be very situational, and what doesn't help is that, the number of activation chits here is so low, there's not going to be a whole lot of breathing room between the end of the turn and the beginning of a turn. So, at least for this combat, for the most part, it's going to be a real slug match of smashing into each other, and I suspect the battle will go very quickly because of that. It's really going to be just a couple of activations to get them close together, then they'll start fighting, and then we'll have our resolution as the fight gets bloody fairly quickly, and we'll see what happens. So, anyway, a lot of intro, but I wanted to explain the way the game systems work. We'll get more into it as we go here, and as I play through the turns. I'll do my best to describe things as we go, so let's get into it. Okay, so for you, that was probably a split-second cut from my intro for this to now, but for me, it's actually been not a couple of days, but like 3 weeks, because life has been very busy. And I couldn't get the time away to do much recording in those 3 weeks, and so I have left the game set up here in my game room for that entire period of time, but here I am. In retrospect, 20 minutes of intro seems like a long time, and I know I'm very verbose in these videos that I always do, but I think it's important to lay out some of the groundwork of the system and the way all of the rules work for Hoplite, and I suspect that I will do less of that in future videos covering different battles, just because a lot of the stuff that I covered in those 20 minutes is going to apply across the board. So we're going to just get right into things here, and if we look at the sequence of play for the game, we would do the initiative phase. Now, by scenario rule, the Spartans have initiative, which means they get to select one of their activation markers to be played first, while the rest of them will be drawn randomly. So we'll go ahead and do that, and I think the Spartans are just going to, just right out of the gate, try to get control of the Thessalian cavalry, and they're going to play their momentum marker. Now, and I guess I'll just set it here as used. Now, the way this works with the special scenario rules is, while I could use this momentum marker to activate units, as a normal formation command, I'm going to instead use it for the die roll for the cavalry. That means I don't get to do anything else, but it seems like right now with the board in sort of a neutral state, it makes sense to just give it a try now while we have an opportunity, and if we succeed, then we don't have to worry about the die roll again, and we can just start using the cavalry. So it's a die roll, and if we get a 6, 7, 8, or 9, the Thessalian cavalry will switch sides. If it's 0 to 5, nothing happens, and it's a wasted activation marker. So here, not really a big deal. I'll just roll the die, and it is a 1. So I guess that was a wasted momentum marker. So much for that. Okay. Okay, so now we'll draw the next activation marker from a cup. I've gone ahead and just put the couple of chits in the big party cup here. I have a better dish that I could use for this, which maybe next time I'm able to record, I'll get out here in the game room. So just randomly pulling out the activation chit, and it is the Athenian. See if you can see that here. It's the Athenian momentum marker. So we will set that over there. And so the Athenian markers can be used to activate the cavalry while they're in control. Or they could use it to activate units. I don't don't know if I want to activate the phalanxes here, and we might as well just try to put the cavalry out on the wings so that they're kind of not an immediate danger in case they do shift their allegiance. So looking at the sequence of play, it's the order phase. So we have movement and missile fire. I'm not going to put these units in melee for shot combat, melee, adjacency for shot combat. So I think we're simply just going to move them through. And I'm not going to attempt to trump as the Spartans. So trumping is to interrupt the activation marker that's been played and discard it and you get a new marker. Because the armies are just far apart, and at some point they've got to come together, so no use interrupting anything yet until the clash begins. So we'll simply have the Athenians activate the Salian cavalry. Now when you do move a unit, if they change facing, that's a movement point to kind of rotate and face a new vertice of the vertex of the hex that they're in. So really not a big deal for us to get moving here. What I want to do is get the cavalry out there sort of in this region here, and we'll have to see what happens later in the battle to see how effective they'll be. So just simply I'm going to take the Salian cavalry. They're both in command. They don't have a leader. They'll always be in command when activated with the momentum chit, and I'm just going to move them. So we'll do each of these has 8 movement points, so basically we will spend those 8 movement points here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's do 7 and then 8, and we'll cock one vertice, and we'll do basically the same thing over here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Rotate a vertice, and I think that's as well as we can make that work. We will draw another activation chit, and this will be the first time we move our phalanx, and it is the upside down Athenian hoplite activation marker. So the Athenians will get to move, and now is where we start to do that special mechanic of how are the units going to how are they going to move forward? So again, the units are going to, for the first time they're moving towards the enemy in combat, which all of them are going to do that. We'll roll a die. That will determine if they're trotting, walking, or running. And then once we've determined that, they will move the maximum number of movement points for what they've rolled. So we'll just go here from left to right and do this. Hopefully I'll just do this very quickly here. I could do it off camera, but just so you can kind of see how we're doing it. So this first one on the far left, we will roll. There is a chart that tells you if you rolled 0 to 1, they walk. 2 to 6 is a trot. 7 or higher is the run. So you have a higher chance of just doing regular movement here, but we'll see. So rolling. Oh, we got a 7. So they are going to get a run marker, and they're going to do their movement. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and because they're running, they finish their move of 5, and now they need to make a TQ check at the end of each move. So we're going to roll a die. If the die roll is greater than the TQ, the unit incurs a cohesion hit. So if we roll a 7 or higher again, that'll be bad. We rolled a 1, so they're okay. Okay, so now I would also potentially put a moved marker here to denote that they've moved, but I'm not going to do that. I know that they've moved. Next unit here, that is a 9, so they're also running. And we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We'll roll a die for the check. And, oh, they failed that check, so they're going to get the first cohesion hit of the battle is the Athenians running too hard and disrupting themselves. Not the best thing that could have happened, obviously. We'll do the next one here. Oh, that's another run. Oh gosh. We'll also move them all the way up. We'll check for the cohesion. They succeeded, but just barely. Next unit down the line is just a trot. So this is where you see the line's going to start to break up. 1, 2, 3, 4. Next unit is another run. Oh, okay. Well, we've got a lot going on now here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's try to do that. I want to try to keep them mostly adjacent to one another if I can. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. And we'll check. They're fine. Okay, next unit. Also a run. Yeesh. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Checking cohesion. And they take a hit. Now the nice thing is, now that they've started moving, I don't need to keep doing this, but it's sort of a preamble to the battle is how they get there. Next unit checking. So that is simply a trot, so we'll get a trot marker here, and they'll move 1, 2, 3, 4. Next unit was a 4, so that's another trot. As soon as I can find a trot marker. 1, 2, 3, 4. Next unit, also a trot. 1, 2, 3, 4. Trying to keep them in line as best I can. The unit with the leader, and the leader will travel with the unit. 0, oh, that's a walk. So, we'll try to get up 1, 2, 3 as best that we can. I guess that's not so bad. Okay, and then we have the final unit. That's also a run. So 1, 2, 3, 4. 5. So this is going to be where there's now a gap in our line with the way that that's set up, unfortunately. Checking the TQ. This unit has a worse troop quality and failed, so it's going to receive a cohesion hit. Now, what's interesting about this is that, you know, they've moved up. They've gone ahead and taken that move. When the next marker is the Spartan chit, assuming they get to activate, a lot of these units are kind of in range of a run or even a trot, and I think it works out that being the attacker here, because this is like they're running or they're approaching, and this is like a counter charge maybe if you want to look at it that way. I think there are some advantages to being on the attack, so this would actually be good potentially for the Spartans to move forward now and attack, and you know, they're probably going to roll runs or trots. Maybe the only thing to worry about are the cavalry here, but this might also be an opportunity for the Athenians to attempt to trump. I'm not sure. I'll have to look at that, so we'll stop here for a moment. Okay, so I want to take a second to explain what's the use of trumping in this particular situation, while I also correct the fact that this unit is walking. So, trumping, the way it works is when a momentum or formation ship is drawn, you can attempt to trump, and if you're able to, basically what you do is you roll a die, and if your die roll is less than your initiative rating of your leader, you get to the same or lower than that initiative rating. Then that activation marker is set aside and not used, and then the trumping player may now select one of their commands to undertake an orders phase. But if you fail that attempt to trump, then the opposing side gets to put their momentum marker back into the pool, or get a second use of it if it's drawn. If it hasn't been drawn yet, they get to use the momentum marker a second time. And so it's a gamble to trump. Now the Spartans didn't bother to trump the Athenian formation marker because they want the Athenians to come to them first, probably. But now if we looked at the activation markers, we would know the only activation marker left is the Spartan Hoplite command. So it's going to be basically the Spartans' only move this turn is going to occur. Now, if the Athenians were able to succeed in trumping that, then they could simply then pass the turn. They probably wouldn't want to move again if they moved all their units, because they've already been moved once this game turn. They would potentially take cohesion hits. We wouldn't want that. But we would be okay with going into the next game turn with a fresh set of markers to be pulled, and that ability to pull an Athenian marker that would allow them now to attack first. So there's definitely a value in attempting to trump. But if they failed, what would happen is that the Spartans would probably get to just go take their action, and then they'd use the momentum marker again to try to take control of the cavalry. And so in this case, while there is value in attempting a trump as the Athenians, I don't think it makes sense to do, because the loss on that gamble would probably give too much advantage to the Spartans. Just to look at what it would take, this leader has an initiative rating of 2, and so we would need to roll 2 or less on the die roll, and it's not a significant amount. So I don't think the benefits outweighs the costs. So we'll simply, as we draw the last activation marker, that will be the Spartans' Hoplite command. So we'll just go ahead and start working that out. I'm going to do the rolls for the movement, and I will do the movement, and we will. I'll bring back recording after I've done that, so you don't watch me go through the whole process again. Okay, so obviously it looks a little bit different here with the turn. So what I had done was I went down the line of these Spartans, and I rolled for their movement speed and then executed their movement. And so now there's a couple of things worth pointing out. So in some cases, we didn't quite have the Spartan line meet the Athenian line. You can see sort of over here in the Athenian right flank, there's a little bit of a gap, and I think that's somewhat advantageous in some ways for the Spartans, just because they can get some combats going here and maybe wipe out some units before the Athenians can apply all their force. Though I would have probably wanted this unit on the far left for the Spartans to meet this unit because it already has a cohesion hit from running, and that unit, which is the let's see, 2nd Corinthian unit, has a much better troop quality, and so would probably fare very well in that combat. So we'll have to see about that. But you can see then there's various points where the lines are meeting along the way, and how they are coming together. Slight gap here that could pose a problem down the way, so we'll have to see how that goes. I will point out that they started their move in command, and I believe that means that they're in command for the rest of the activation. But on future activations, it could pose a problem. However, when units are engaged in shock combat, I believe they'll continue to fight in shock combat even out of command, so it probably won't be a big deal. Something I'm going to show, I have it upside down because I have the markers done in such a way, but I'm going to spin that one. I'm going to try to zoom in on it, so let's zoom in. So, don't want to make you sick, I'm sorry. So I have, in addition, these extra markers notated here. So when units have come into, when you finish your movement phase, if units are going to engage in shock combat, which they will because they're in each other's front hexes, you will have either a shock must TQ check or a shock no TQ check. And what this basically denotes is for the attacking unit, because they've become adjacent to an enemy unit without already have been adjacent to it, just meaning coming from farther away and coming to the defender. They don't need to make a troop quality check at the beginning of shock, which is it's part of that advantage I mentioned about being the one to counter charge or to be the attacker in the initial clash. So that's a good thing for the Spartans. And one thing I'll just point out is over here, you'll notice that this Spartan, the gray unit here, has a red triangle on it. And what that means is that's an actual Spartan hoplite unit, hoplite, whatever, unit. And basically those units don't roll for movement. They're always going to be trot. So I did put a trot marker there to denote that. So that they're not at risk of being walking or running, which can sometimes be difficult to manage. They're always going to be able to trot. But either way, that was enough to bring it into range with the running Athenian unit there. And so they're going to conduct combat with the leader present. Again, you can start to see that cavalry unit over here is going to be sort of positioned to be able to come out behind the Spartans. So we'll see how that works in the next turn and how the die rolls go there. But now that we actually do have, I'm going to zoom out again, units that are clashing for shock combat, we'll address that next. So we'll do a little cut here as I prepare for that. Okay, one thing I should have pointed out earlier is that when we were doing movement, it was the movement in fire phase, and if we had any ranged units in this battle, they would have been able to conduct ranged fire and reaction fire and all kinds of stuff related to that. But in this particular battle, we just have formed formations and the light melee cavalry, and so we didn't have to do any ranged combat or anything like that. In other battles, I believe, at least in some of the Great Battles of History series, you can have ranged units move and fire and move again, depending on how the rules are. And obviously there's a lot of interactivity with that, but here in this battle, very simple, we don't actually have that. Now the way we're supposed to resolve the shock combat is the shock combat phase is sort of separated into a couple of different steps, and you're supposed to resolve each individual step for everything on the board before you move on to the next step. And the purpose of that is to avoid weird situations where you can sort of react to the results of a neighboring combat to influence how that movement after combat or results of the other combat are going to go. There's some weirdness there, but it'll be all right. Basically, we'll just go through all the steps. And the first step is to see if, for the units that were marked with a TQ, must have a TQ check before combat, to do that and see if they'll actually fail to engage the enemy. Now, in the previous clip here that you just watched, I had already placed all of the little markers here on the units showing that they don't need to do a TQ check. So we don't actually have any actions to take there. And then the second step is to check all defending units except those that are engaged to see how they will react to the threat of the attack. And I don't believe anything's going to change here. Let me just double check. Okay, so here, because we have defending units that are not already engaged, so for all of these units that are about to have melee combat, they have not been engaged before, they're going to do some TQ checks. Yeah, and if the die roll is higher than the troop quality, then they're going to incur a number of cohesion hits equal to the difference. Oh boy. And if the DR is the same or lower, then they're fine. Okay, and so if we look here, it's really going to be this unit, this unit, this unit, this unit, this unit, this unit, this unit. So we have 7 units that are going to have to make this check. And I guess it's sort of the, if you see a bunch of guys coming at you to fight, there's that split second of, a fight or flight response maybe to see if these guys can stand fast with the approaching enemy. So because these units all have not been engaged yet, the defenders, the Athenians, they must make this TQ check for each one. So we'll go through this one. Matched it. So he's fine. We'll do this unit. He's fine. We'll do this unit. He's fine. Here. He's fine. There. Fine. Oh, alright, so this unit failed the check by 1, and so he's going to actually get another cohesion hit, which is not good for the Athenians. And then the final unit on the far left side for the Athenians are fine. So that could have been much more dangerous than it was, but 6 is a pretty good troop quality, and so not a whole lot to be worried about there. So then the next step is going to be resolve any leader personal combat or check for leader casualties. So if we had in this combat the units with leaders attached fighting each other, meaning the leaders are adjacent fighting another leader, there would be a personal combat die roll between those leaders because, as a part of ancient combat, I guess sometimes these leaders like to try to take each other out for the glory of doing so. But in this case, our leader, one leader is not engaged. This leader is engaged, but they're not fighting another leader. But because they are engaged in combat, we are going to have to do a leader check. If I check here in the rules, if there is no personal combat, only one player has leaders present, then the owning player rolls a die for each involved leader. If the die roll is 0, the leader is wounded. On any other result, there is no effect. So we're going to roll the die for the Spartan leader over here and hope it's not a 0. And it is a 9, so he is fine. And now that step of the melee shock combat phase is done. And now we actually get to resolve the shock. So there's resolve the shock, and then we check for collapse. After this, I'm going to stop the video here. I'm going to start recording for a second and just collect myself for that. So 1 second. Okay, something I should point out, I swear not all these Great Battles of History videos will be so verbose, but it's worth going through this. When we set up the beginning of the shock phase, what we need to do as the attacker, the active player, is determine what the matchups are going to be for adjacent units. And this is important because if you don't do it the right way, you may end up in situations where your attacking unit has to attack more than one unit. It has to attack all the units that are in its front hexes, or in other Great Battles of History games, there's zone of control. In Hoplite, we don't have zones of control, but we do have the mechanic of the front-facing hexes. So like one way to look at this would be if you had a unit sort of on the tail ends of your line. Here's an example. If this unit was actually up here, this unit would have to attack both of these units at the same time, which would be bad for it in the shock combat rolls. If this unit wasn't being attacked by this unit, but the problem is it has these units in front of it, and it would have, it's kind of hard to, it makes sense. In my head, I totally understand what it's going for. What basically you're trying to do is have one-on-one combats, and if there's ever a case where you have more than one unit in that front-facing hex that isn't already being attacked, you have to make sure you're attacking everything that can be attacked. And again, gosh, I'm probably not explaining it very well, but you can see the matchups are here. So over here it's 1v1, 1v1, 1v1. This unit is not adjacent, it's behind. So this is sort of a result of those different movement ratings. This would be harder to figure out how we wanted to do this combat, but because there's this gap, these units have their matchups figured out. Over here, same here, there's a matchup here, there's a matchup here. Again, now there's a gap, and then back over here we have a matchup, and then the tail end matchup over here. And that's probably going to change again in the next turn when the units are shifting around some more, and we'll have to figure out what the matchups are there. But for each of these shock combats now, we're really just dealing with a 1v1 for each roll. There's not going to be numerical advantages or anything like that. We've set it up and have declared the combat such that as the Spartans, these one-on-one matchups are situated that way. And so, I should maybe move the camera around so we're looking at it from the Spartan perspective, but it's easier to keep the camera here. What we're going to do is we're going to move our way as the Spartans from left to right. So we're going to start over here, and we're just going to go down the line, resolving these combats. So the first one we'll do is this one over here. I'll also point out that we'll eventually remove these movement markers at the end of this turn, because they're not going to be relevant anymore. All these units, or most of these units, have engaged in combat, so most of these markers will be removed because they've now engaged with an enemy. But that running that the units had, running actually impacts shock combat, which we'll get to here in just a second. So again, I'm going to pause for a second as I get ready to go, and I'm going to zoom in nice and close for these two combats over here that you can see. Okay, so looking at the very first combat, so how we're going to do this is first we try to determine the superiority of the situation. Again, we're looking at these two units in combat. The Athenians were trotting, and the Corinthians on the Spartan side were running. That run is actually going to advantage the Spartans. They're going to use their momentum here to hurt the enemy on the attack. Now, if this was a game of simple great battles of history, there'd be we'd work this out very differently. Shock combat works pretty differently. In simple great battles of history, you use troop quality even as a modifier in combat. But here, this is going to be a really straightforward slug match. So we do the hand-to-hand struggle, looking at the comparative weapon systems. Now, there would be superiority for either side if we were dealing with like attacking from the flank or from the rear, but that's not happening here. It's a straight on, so the attacker doesn't get superiority for that. So if we don't have positional superiority, we then look at the shock superiority chart for their weapon systems, and if we look at that, this is a hoplite versus a hoplite, HO versus an HO, and so there is no superiority there. So just right away, this is going to be a straight up whatever we get on the die roll results chart. Then we look at our adjusting of columns and then resolve a die roll. So if we looked at how to adjust the columns, is there a numerical advantage? Well, no. It's one unit versus one unit. If there were 2 units versus 1 or more than that, we would get shifts on our die roll column, so there will be no shifts for that, unfortunately. And there's no shifts regarding terrain, because we're simply, in a lot of great battles of history, we're just on flat terrain for both the attacker and the defenders. There's nothing really to worry about there. And now we're going to roll the die as the attacker. We're going to modify the die roll for things like the presence of leaders, the effects of run, and if there's locked shield wall formation. Now, locked shield wall formation is something that you can do with a unit on its movement phase. You can actually order that unit to form a locked standing formation, but that's what they do for their movement, and neither of these sides have bothered to do that. I didn't really see a reason to do that. So I'm going to look at the comparative weapon system chart, and a hoplite versus a hoplite puts us on the 7 CRT column of the shock combat results table. And you'll have to follow along at home or just trust me on how this goes. So the CRT column is 7, and in terms of die roll modifiers, so there's no commander involved in this combat, though there are commanders nearby. They're not in the combat itself, so there's no modifier for that. There is a +2 die roll modifier because our attacking hoplite was running here, and this is only for the initial shock, but this is sort of like the charging attack. And I believe that is it for all the die roll modifiers here. So it's simply going to be a die roll. We're going to check on the CRT. Die roll +2. Okay, not a great roll. I rolled a 4, +2 is 6. So if I look on here, it is a 2 cohesion hits for the attacker, 2 cohesion hits for the defender. So just take a look at that. Da, 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 da. Okay, so each gets 2 cohesion hits, which means that the attacking unit goes up to 3, and the unit we have that it was attacking go to 2. And what will matter is if these were single sized units, so like the Salian cavalry, when they reach their troop quality number and cohesion hits, that's typically when they're going to rout. It works a little bit differently for these double-sized units. They can actually go above their troop quality number and cohesion hits before they will rout, but there's a check for that. So for now, in this matchup, the Athenians are kind of doing a little bit better, if only because these Spartans were running, and in that combat die roll, they didn't really roll as well as they could have to get a better die roll. Now, if there was superiority in play here, so if we were able to get an attack through the flank or rear, that would have been like an attack superiority. That doubles the defender's cohesion hit, so we could have inflicted 4 instead of 2 and come out better there, but we just don't have the position for it. Looking at this combat here, which would be the next one that we were looking at, it's basically this is going to be the exact same set of principles here. So there is no superiority, and the chart is going to be the 7 chart, and we still get a +2 because this unit was also running. So this is another die roll +2, and we'll see. A little bit better because we don't already have a cohesion loss here. Oof, well, that was much better. So I rolled a 9, +2 is 11, and if I look at that on the chart, that's above the chart. So we rolled a 9, +2 is 11, so 1, 4. So our attacking unit gets 1 cohesion, and this defending unit gets smacked very hard for 4, and that's fairly significant. That's a really good die roll. So that went well for the Spartans. And I'm going to move our camera here to the next set of combat. So again, we have a one-on-one matchup on each side here. Center, we have no superiority. We're going to use the 7-column chart. There are no other shifts on the column. And I'll point out the Athenians were running, but if you're not the attacker, it doesn't appear that there's any die roll modifier to like against the attacker if the attacker wasn't running and the defender was running. So the fact that the Athenians were running here appears to not make any difference for them. But because the Spartans don't have a +2 die roll modifier, it's simply going to be a straight die roll. So we'll see how that goes. And of course, I just wrecked through my own. Of course I did. Okay. Let's see here. Oh, that's unfortunate. Let's get that going here. I want to think that's how that went. That's what I get for rolling on my own table. I'll fix things up here in a second, so I'm going to stop the video and fix it. Okay, I got things back to where they needed to be. I double-checked and looked at my recording that I had just stopped, and we got things back. I'm going to have to just be careful with die rolling. That gets me in trouble at conventions, I'm sure. Anyway, so we did roll really well, even with the catastrophe of the counter. So we rolled an 8 on this combat. Now again, in this matchup, we didn't have any sort of superiority. We don't have even a run bonus. And so on the 7 chart, with an 8, which is still pretty good, we inflict 3 and we get 2. So it's a 2-3 result. And we'll put that down here. So 2 for our Spartans. Really, it's their allies, not the Spartans themselves. and the Athenians are now up to 4 on here, so not terribly good for them. Okay, and then in the neighboring combat, there is a run, so we are going to get some of the bonuses here. So if I just look, yeah, there's nothing else, so it's going to be die roll +2. Oof, I only rolled a 1, so a 3 is, oh, okay, it's a 2 and a 2, so it's not as bad as it could have been, but that was a really not great roll. So that's a 2 and a 2. And then we finally have the 3 combats over here, and this is a potential here. This Athenian unit right here is pretty beat up, so we could see some action here. So just starting again on the furthest side here. Again, all things are basically the same. We do have a +2 to the die roll, and I got a 9, +2 is 11. So that's another 1 for the Spartan side, and a 4 for the Athenian side. So quite good. And then if we look over here, now there's no run bonus, so this is merely a straight die roll. Rolled a 6, and that is a 2 and 2. So still not great because this unit's already gotten beat up. Whoops, I need to grab the right counter. There we go. So up to 4, this one's up to 2, and then finally we have the very last matchup here to conduct, and that is with the leader. So here, all else is the same. We're not running, but we do have a leader, and this is going to be, we're going to use the overall commander's charisma rating. And if I look, I need to double check which of those numbers is actually the charisma rating. This is the lower right number, and that's a 2. So we actually get, even though we weren't running, which it might have been nice to be running in this case, we still get a +2 to the die roll here. So we'll go ahead and do that. That's a 6, which is a 2 and a 2, so nothing too crazy. 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. We'll mark it thusly. Okay. Now, that's all of the shock resolving, and now we would have the collapse step. We would do this all across the board, and I'll zoom out again here. Whoops. Just so we can get back to kind of where things are at. Maybe zoom in a little bit for you. So for here, now we're going to be checking the units with cohesion hits against their troop quality number. So let's see. Do we have any units that have cohesion hits equal to or greater than their TQ? No, not quite yet. Still early in the fight. Do we have any units that have cohesion hits equal to 1 less than their TQ? No, not quite yet. We're close, but not quite yet. And then we would have attacking units advance into hexes vacated by enemy units. But that is not the case, and yeah, I think that is it. There's no advance after combat here because we just haven't created any circumstances for that. And I believe that is the end of the shock combat phase. Check for possible collapse, yep. Okay. Now we would go through here, and because it is the end of the turn and we're out of activation markers, we would check for route movement, but no one's routed quite yet. We'd remove rallied and moved markers. We'd flip out of command units to their front side. Place replacements, no thing there. Reload segment, and then withdrawal phase to check to see if we end the game. So that is the end of the turn. Probably one thing I need to do is add some engaged markers for these combats here. Maybe I'll do that here off camera, but that was game turn 1. And we'll go into game turn 2 with all of the activation markers available, and we'll check the initiative and all that good fun stuff. So we'll keep it going. Okay, so now I placed all the engaged markers. I put them on top of the units a lot of the time, but for the unit with the leader, because there's just a lot going on there, I put it way behind. Now, with the leader being engaged, that actually has some negative effects for the Spartans. Namely, because he's engaged, he is not going to be able to trump, which is bad. And the other thing is his command rating, I believe, is halved, which is going to make some of these units out there, especially out on the wings, not able to be in range for command. So that's going to pose, I think, a major problem here, but we'll get into that. Now that we're at the beginning of turn 2, we're going to determine initiative. And so what that is that each side is going to roll a die. They're going to add their overall commander's initiative rating, and the high roll wins initiative. Now, both overall commanders in this battle have a +2, so it's simply a straight up die roll. So first, I'm going to roll for the Spartans. I rolled a 1, and for the Athenians, I rolled a 1. Okay. Well, that was unexpected. When you tie for the initiative die roll, that means all the activation markers go in the cup, and you simply draw randomly. So we're going to do that, and we'll see what we get. So first one is the Spartan momentum marker, and I think we're going to go for that die roll again for the cavalry. And we get it. We do get it. Yes. So the cavalry may now immediately activate, and I think... What do we want to do here? Well, first of all, because they've now switched sides, if the Thessalians desert and join the Spartans, those units count as route points against the Athenians as if they were eliminated. If the Spartans gain control of the Thessalians, any eliminated units are going to be route points for them. But just right away, that means, let's see, 5, that's 11. The Athenians get 11 route points right out of the gate for that. So that's bad for the Athenians, obviously, just for that reason alone. And now they're going to get to activate, the Spartans will get to activate them. So I think, I'm trying to think what's the best way to make use of them. So, I talked earlier in the video about how these cavalry units aren't going to be terribly good in combat unless they are, unless they are going to be double teaming units, and they typically aren't going to be very valuable if they attack on their own. Maybe they could be used to disperse units that are already routing, but these large phalanx units that are in this battle tend to route a little bit differently anyway. So let's see. I'm just going to go ahead on the right, or what is now the Spartan left flank. I'm going to have the Thessalian cavalry go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and just situate that way. If you can see that, he's over here, so he's moving around to be behind the Athenians. And then I think what I want to have happen here is I just want to have this, I think I might as well try it, is just do 1, 2, 3, and it will now be engaged in the flank here. I think it's worthwhile to try it. I mean, at least for this demonstration purposes, to see what happens when we get over there. Actually, before we do that, I'm gonna stop recording. I'm just gonna validate and see how this is gonna work. Okay, never mind. I just had to look. What's interesting is that if that cavalry were to attack the unit there on the Athenian left by itself here, or rather, if it were to attack, it would be by itself, because when you do shock combat resolution, it's the activated units that are attacking. So the Spartan hoplites that are already engaged with the unit actually would not be getting to attack in this phase, I don't believe. I'm reading through the rules to try to double check, but it appears that, because we're activating the cavalry formation, the hoplite formation is not actually activated to attack, and so in that combat, it would be treated as just the cavalry attacking that unit there. And unfortunately, there are some special rules with light cavalry that they do not gain attacker superiority against units like hoplites, regardless of the positioning, apparently. So it really would make no sense at all for that cavalry to attack there. So, like I said earlier in the video, the use of this light cavalry is just not, it doesn't seem to exist very well, other than maybe to swoop in and attack some units that are already routing. But again, these phalanx units, when they begin routing, they tend to go poof anyway. So anyway, I think the main point is that the Spartans got to get them on their side. That immediately inflicted rout points, so goodness for the Spartans. We'll see how it goes. The next chit will now be drawn, and by the way, that kind of opens it up now that if the Spartan momentum chit is drawn later in the turn, they're going to have the opportunity to move their units again. So we'll see how that goes. And we draw the Athenian momentum marker. Now, there's not much that they can really do here other than activate the units that they have. They don't have the cavalry anymore. And so there's not much left for them to do. They might as well just activate their unit. Yeah, I think they're going to look to activate their hoplites, and that just means if they draw their hoplite marker later in the turn, they'll just get to use it again. So I'm going to pause recording here for a second, and I'm going to work through some of this initial steps of getting all these units going, because I'm looking here, I'm pretty sure all of the Athenian units are going to be in command. So that shouldn't be any issue for any of the units, but there will be some movement. So I will show that here just as soon as I'm done organizing it all. Okay, jumping back in here for a second. So I removed a lot of the walk, trot, run markers just to clean up the map a little bit. Technically, you should keep them on for the rest of battle because that movement speed is what the unit's supposed to have, I guess, for the entire battle, even after engagement. Maybe I read that wrong, but I can't imagine we're going to be worried too much about huge amounts of movement now that the lines are crashing into one another. I did complete the movement for the Athenians, so obviously all the units that are engaged, I left engaged and fighting, but the units that weren't quite up to the line have moved up. So there's a movement up here. The unit had to wheel and pivot like this to get into this combat here, so it'll be like 2-on-1, but they did suffer a cohesion hit for doing that. We also had movement here, so this unit came up into the gap and will be facing off up there. And then finally, we had the leader unit move up to get a 2-on-1 advantage over here, and we'll see how that works out. And then finally on the far right, this running unit continued running to the walking Corinthian unit out there on the Athenian right. So at this point, once we go into the shock phase, all units will be engaged in some capacity, and that's where things are going to get a little more hairy. The Athenians enter this battle with more units, so they're going to have that advantage on doubling up units, and that could be a really key factor in whether or not the Athenians can win. So there were no other reaction movement or anything like that. I did put down a couple of must TQ check or no TQ check required for the units that have newly entered adjacency to the enemy, and then we'll start to work our way through shock combat here in just a second. Okay, so in talking with attacking selections. I think this is the way that the Athenians are going to do it. So they're on the left. We're going to have 1v1, 1v1, and then we're going to have 2 versus 1 here. This will be the first 2-on-1 combat that we would have seen, though I think we'll check that out. 1-on-1, 1-on-1, new combat 1-on-1. As we go over to the right, we'll have this 1-on-1. Here will be a 2-on-1 on the far right, and then a 1-on-1 up here. So just worth calling out that needs to be done. Also, I would normally have placed a bunch of shock, no TQ check markers on all of the engaged Athenian units that are already engaged. They must shock, but they don't need a TQ check. I'm not going to bother placing all those markers because I know what's going on. In a bigger combat, it might be more valuable, especially with an opponent that everybody knows what's going on. But I think it's pretty busy already with all the counters on the map. So they will all have to do the TQ checks once we get into that. And now I believe we can get into the proper shock resolution. Okay, so as we look to do the shock combat here, just like in the previous section where we did the Spartans, we're going to go through that whole thing again. As we look through here, we don't need to do any checking for the attackers because they don't need to do a check to attack due to their movement. But we are going to check the defenders that are not engaged yet. So that would mean this unit, and I think that's it. So they need to do TQ checks. Roll for this guy here, he's fine. We roll for this guy here, and he's fine. So no additional cohesion hits for being attacked. They're hardy enough to know that fighting's going to happen anyway. And now we're going to do the leader loss. So now maybe you made a mistake by attacking with this unit with the Athenian leader, because now that he's done that, he's in that zone. He's not going to be able to trump, which I would have been useful, I guess, as the Athenians, but maybe we don't need to trump. There's no use trumping. And his command range is halved, but if you see all along through here, all of the Athenian units are adjacent to one another along the line, and so they are fine for command range. And even this guy over here, you can count enough spaces for command range that it's fine. So the Athenians, maybe it's not a big deal, they move forward, but they're going to have to roll for a leader loss. So we will roll, and what we want to avoid is a 0. I rolled a 9, so almost, but no, so the leader is fine. And now we're going to do the checks, just like we did before. So running all the way through. Now, I should point out there's going to be no bonus for the units that had run before. So all of the Athenian units that had previously been running and were attacked by the Spartans, they don't get a bonus to their shock roll, because it's for the first shock, the first shock roll that occurs with that unit. So it was the Spartans who got to roll, and so the Athenians don't get to roll. But if we looked at the units now that we had sent out, this unit will actually get a run bonus, and I guess that's it. So we'll have to just deal with it. Which, I mean, if we looked at just the odds, I don't think the Athenians are going to do particularly well, but we'll see. So we're going to zoom in. We're going to do these 3 shock results first. And just we're going to move from left to right the whole way down the line. And again, we're not going to do any advance after combats. All of that will be done in the next phase of shock resolution. So in that far left combat, now both units have 2 cohesion hits already, and they have to shock. So even if the Spartans are probably going to do better because they have the leader involved, Oh, you know what? I think we need to do a check for him as well. Yeah, okay. So we're going to roll for the Spartan leader. 5. He is fine. Okay. So, just like before, we look at our shock superiority chart. Hoplite versus Hoplite is no advantage, and Hoplite versus Hoplite is a 7 on the combat results chart. And then for the actual die roll modifiers, it's going to be a -2 because of the leader involved on the Spartan side, and that appears to be it. So this is actually pretty bad for the Athenians because they're probably not going to roll very well here for this combat. So let's see what it gets. 3 minus 2 is a 1, and ooh, that's not good. That is not good at all. So that is a 3 loss to the attacker, 1 to the defender, and so this becomes a 3 for the Spartan, and then yeah, we get 3 up to 5 for this unit. So if I were a betting man, I would say that the Athenian unit will probably, at this point, break before the Spartan unit. Then we have this other matchup, which, again, isn't terribly good for the Athenians. In fact, we might see one of the units here. It might be the Athenian routing, so we'll see. So for there, it's no superiority, 7 on the chart, and it is just a straight die roll because there are no other modifiers. Oh, we rolled a 9, so that's actually pretty good. So that's a 2 to 4. Interesting. Okay, so I gotta grab the right counters here. So the Spartan gets 4 up to 6, or Spartan ally, not actually Spartans, and this gets 2. And so they're both at 6. And when we get to the collapse step of shock, we'll have to see how that works out. Just doing a quick double check here. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens here, but that was a pretty tough fight there. So now we have this combat. Now this one's going to be a little bit different than all the other combats we've done up to this point. So first, we're going to look at superiority. Now, this unit had to wheel this way, and so it's all coming through the front. And so there's no superiority for weapon system or for position. But if we look at adjusting the columns of resolve, there is a numerical advantage. If one side has more combat units in the combat than the other, that player receives a 2-column shift for each unit it has more than the other side. Such a shift would be to the right for the attacker's benefit, to the left for the defender's benefit. So, because there's one more unit here for the Athenians than the Spartans involved in this combat, we're going to get a shift of 2 on the combat chart. I don't believe they're going to get any other modifier for the combat. And that would mean that they are going to get to be on the 9 chart of the CRT table, and we'll do our die roll here for that. Ouch. They rolled a 0, which is a 9-1, or I'm sorry, on the 9 chart, that's a 3-1 result. Now, let's see. divvy up those losses how they want. Let's see here. There is a rule for this, 10.13, so I'm just going to check that while I'm recording here. Okay, so there's a hierarchy. If it was used to determine superiority or the shock CRT column, then you have to give to that unit. But since they're both the exact same kind of unit, we can distribute the losses here. So I think it makes sense to divvy it up this way so that they're even on both. So unfortunately that unit's going to take some, and then this unit merely takes the 1. So this was honestly just a bit of bad luck for the Athenians. They had 2-on-1. They really should have come out a little bit better than that. They got a better column shift, but I think modifiers are ultimately more valuable than column shifts because you get you just get better results no matter what. You can still roll crap with multiple units, so that's a bummer. That is a bummer for them. Okay, now we're going to start to go more towards the center set of combats. So we have this one here, which is a standard straight-up die roll combat on the 7 chart, which was a 3, which is a 2-2 result. So we now have 4 and 4 here. So these guys are getting tired, for sure. And then we have this combat, which unfortunately is going to be less good for the Athenians, I suspect, because they're already beat up more. They rolled pretty good. 6 on a 7 it's just a 2-2. So this is actually not very good for the Athenians because they are now at a 6 here, while the Spartans are merely at a 4. Then in this combat here, they will be engaged now, and I'm just going to put this here for the future. This is also just a straight up die roll, and both units are basically fresh, so we'll see. Oh, that was a 2, so not very good. On the 7 chart, actually, that's 2 and 2, so could be worse. And then we'll look at the right side of the battlefield. Here and here, the Corinthian unit is much better off than the Athenian, so I suspect the Athenians are going to have some trouble. Oh, for sure, they just rolled a 0. On the 7 chart is a 3-1. Okay, so that means this is up to a 2, and this actually goes to a 7, and I have a 7 right here. So that's not good. That unit is going to break. And now we have another 2-on-1 combat, and I think this one's going to go the Athenians' way for sure. So this is another case of no superiority here has occurred, and we avoided pivoting because he entered into that front hex, and wheeling would have given a cohesion hit anyway. So we look at the shock combat now. 2 units versus 1. That's a shift to the 9 column. And we do have a leader involved that's going to provide a +2 to the die roll. So this is a much better situation for the Athenians. We'll roll the die. We rolled a 5 +2 is 7. A 7 on the 9 chart gives us a 2-3 result. So I think we'll let this unit take the 2, and then the 3 will go here, and what we'll end up with is, it's going to be a 6, if you were facing this way, a 6 for that Corinthian unit, which means that unit is kaput, so to speak. And then finally, we have the combat over here, and this is going to be a straight up one-on-one, no superiority, using the 7 column, but the +2 for running. And unfortunately rolled a 0, so a +2 just gets us to 2 on the 7 chart is a 2 and 2, so nothing too terribly exciting. That brings this unit to 3. And 2. So honestly, probably didn't go as well as it could have been for the Athenians. I mean, they're doing the right thing over here. They're getting that 2-on-1 advantage. They need to fold that flank. But we have several spots along the center and the left part of the battlefield where they're about to break. So the chaos is picking up here. So I'm gonna stop recording here for a second, and we'll look at the collapse piece. Okay, so we're going to go through the collapse step of shock combat. It's really the last part of it, and there are actually 3 different phases to it that we all have to do each across the board in order. So first thing is we're going to check the route status of units that have cohesion hits equal to or greater than their troop quality number. We're going to do that the whole way down the line. When that's complete, we're going to check the status of units that have the number of cohesion hits equal to 1 less than their troop quality number. That's actually the case in a couple of places, or actually make that just maybe the 1 place on the board. And then finally, at the very end, the attacking units, if possible, will advance their hex. So we'll do all of those things in order across the entire map, each in turn, and we'll go through it. So just going from left to right here, we'll look at the left side of the field. These guys are not going to be looked at in this first step, but here we do. So we have both units here. If I look at their troop quality number, 6, 6, both are meeting their threshold. But if all units involved would rout, you compare the attacking unit with the greatest difference between its hits, plus any hits it would incur by advancing after combat, and its troop quality to the defending unit with the greatest difference between hits and TQ. All the units on the side with the greater difference rout, and the other units do not, and they get their cohesion hits reduced. But because they're both at 6, and their troop quality is 6, it's tied, I believe. So let me see, let me just make sure about the advance after combat piece. Yeah, I believe that this unit would not take cohesion hits if it advanced after combat. I'm just making sure here. Yeah, so it should be good. So when that is the case, it is the defender who routes. So this is another one of those attacker benefit pieces of the game, it appears. So if the differences are the same, the defender routes. The effect of routing varies with unit type. So usually light single hex-sized units will simply start moving backwards towards the back of the map, towards the retreat edge. But these are big, long phalanx units, so we will have to see here with that unit. I also believe that this sets the TQ to 5 now. If I'm reading this right in the collapse rules, so the defender's going to route, that unit is not going to route, and it gets set 1 reduced cohesion hit. And now for this Spartan allied phalanx that is going to rout, we're going to roll a die, and out of the die roll the number of hits the unit has incurred in excess of their troop quality number, which is 0. And we would add an additional 2 if the unit was the attacker in the combat. It is not the attacker in the combat. So we're going to roll a die and see what we get. So we got a 9, which is high. So if the modified result is higher than the unit's troop quality, which it is, the unit rounds and moves per 10-21. Otherwise, it would get to stand in place and recover some cohesion. So if we look at 10-21, okay, all right. So sorry guys, I'm making the video longer, I know, but okay. So yeah, we're gonna remove the engage marker and the hits marker. We're going to find one of our routed markers. And this unit's going to turn immediately around and go 1, 2, 2 hexes. So the Athenians have 1, and we're going to have a potential advance here that I would like to mark somehow, but I don't think I have a marker to do it with. I'm going to just put a moved marker here to remind myself that it needs to advance after combat. Okay, so that is done. Now, just to keep in mind, this would be a great opportunity if this was the reverse situation where that unit is retreating, where any unit that now can get to it and hit it and cause a cohesion hit will cause that unit to just instantly be eliminated for the route points. However, when we get to the end of the turn, if that unit is still routing, because it's a big, heavy phalanx unit, it simply evaporates anyway. So probably not much we're going to be able to do to save it unless the Spartans on their turn are able to do something to save that unit. But it might just be a lost cause and we focus on eliminating Athenian units rather than try to call that unit back. We'll have to look at the situation. Now we will just go ahead and go over to here, and we have this case here where a unit has routed or has its the right number of route or cohesion hits rather, and so we will roll a die for it because it is a phalanx unit, and it didn't freak out. Since we rolled less than, the unit does not rout, it stands in place with its cohesion hit set equal to its its TQ minus 1. So this one stood fast. It goes down to 5. It's actually a good thing there for it. Then going further down the line, we have the unit with the 7. So we're going to roll to see if it routs, and we need to add a 1 to the die roll. And if it exceeds the TQ, there's going to be a problem. So rolled 1 plus 1 is 2. 2 is less than 7. And so while it was at 7, it is going to reduce down to 5, 1 less than its TQ maximum or TQ number. So that's actually a really good roll for the Athenians there. That's going to work out. And then we have over here this particular unit, and we're just going to roll the die. Oop. And I rolled an 8 just now, and that's actually really bad. He's going to rout, so we'll take this off here, and we need another route marker somewhere around here. If you're still watching this video, kudos to you. I know it's probably getting very long. So it's going to flip around, go 1, 2, and has a routed marker. And then everything else is fine. So now we're going to look at units in the combat that have cohesion hits equal to 1 less than their TQ are now checked for rout if still adjacent to any opposing units involved in the same combat. Failing scenes to pass the check do not make this. So I think we're just going to have this one unit here that we need to do this for. Okay, so we're going to have to check. I don't even have the camera on the right place. This unit didn't have a change, and we need to check it for routing. So what we're going to do is we're going to roll, and if the DR is less than the troop calling number, we get to heal a cohesion, and if not, then we potentially rout. So die roll goes flying off the table, which we don't count, and we rolled a 1. So he actually gets to go down to 4 cohesion hits. So I think the Athenians are actually doing pretty well here. Okay, so now, let's see here. Okay, so we're going to have our advances after combat. Now I believe this unit will have to advance like so. And it can't pivot necessarily at the moment, so it's going to advance like that. If we look down the line, then over here, either of these units could advance. I think I want this unit to advance. And let me take the engaged off here. And remove some of these other markers out of the way that are no longer needed. So he advanced. And we won't have the leader unit advance, doesn't have to advance. We want to keep him probably unengaged so he can trump now. I think even after this combat, I get the feeling like the Athenians are probably maybe going to win this fight. Just the way that combat went and how well they were able to hold on given the situation. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, so we did all of our advances, so I believe that's the end of that activation. Quite a long activation, I know. We still have more activations to go, and we'll pull the chit, and it is Athenian Hoplites. Athenian Hoplites. Okay. I Oh no. With the Athenian hoplites, we would get to go again. And then what I probably should have done is put some moved markers on some of these units. So I think we would have had one here. I sort of screwed up by taking those off. I think we had one here. We obviously had one here. And I think we had one somewhere else. I think over here. So, and the reason why that's important is if, I'm going to zoom out here so you can kind of see a little bit better. So we have another Athenian activation. They can activate the exact same set of units, but if they moved again, not talking about melee, but if they moved again, they would take a cohesion hit, which some of that might work. I don't know. Need to think about that for a second. This might also be a good opportunity for the Athenians to try to do something else with their order. I'm going to stop recording. I'm going to think this through for a little bit. Okay, so what we're going to have the Athenians do is we are going to do a move and fire order, and we're not going to move any units, so we're not going to incur any more cohesion hits because of that. So no movement is going to take place. We do have to have shock combat because that's just a part of, it's happening regardless. But what we can do is we can have 2 cohesion hits removed from this unit if it doesn't move, and the leader won't move. It doesn't want to engage in any more combat, so it gets to recover 2 cohesion hits in a move and fire order phase. Again, assuming they don't move and they're not adjacent to an enemy, they can recover 2 hits. This unit can't because it is adjacent to an enemy to its side, and that's as good as it can get. So all these moved markers, they're kind of irrelevant, not needed anymore. We're no longer moving. And so I think because we're not moving, we just go immediately into a shock combat phase. And what I'm just going to do is, just to save on time, I'm going to go through this extra round of shock combat and our return recording to show you the aftermath. So, before we return, here's the state of things before we come back. Okay, so things got a little crazy. On the left side, we almost had some Athenian units break, and in fact we did have one here, so this double attack on this unit failed spectacularly. And while the Athenians are trying to hold the line with this sort of diagonal placed unit, this unit began routing. Down the line, units are getting tired, but we're not quite at the point where things are falling apart. Though it's very nearly so with some units, not the point of breaking. And then over here, you can sort of see, we've got a little bit of chaos. So, we've had the Spartan unit routing. This unit is routing. I need to get rid of that engaged marker. And so you can almost see how there's an opportunity for some chaos right there in the center where some units are falling away. And then again over here, things are just kind of in a interesting situation. So now, we would have what is the last activation draw, and I think what the Athenians want to have happen here is they would like to attempt to trump this activation marker. So this is the last one. It's the Spartan Hoplite command. What they would like to do is, if they can succeed on the trump, that is negated and we could potentially look at the end of the turn. But the problem is it's a very tough die roll. Now, if they fail the attempt, though, that could give the Spartans the opportunity to turn it around. But I think it might be worth the risk here, because if these units are simply removed, that's going to be 12, 24, 36. I mean, that's going to be enough to win the game outright, because the battle will be over when we get to the end of the turn. Now, over here, that's going to be 12, 24, plus the 11 they already have. It would still be less than the 45 for the Athenians to rout. So we could actually see the Spartans lose right here, because what's going to happen is if they can trump, then the Spartan activation will be canceled, and then they won't bother to take an extra activation. We'll just let the end of the turn run, and that will bring us to the end of the game, the end of the battle. So I think it's worth a shot, because even if the Spartans get it, they're going to have a hard time rallying. So we're going to try. So the Athenian player is going to attempt to trump. They can do so because their leader is over here. He's all fine and dandy. Just make sure there's anything else going on. Yeah, okay, so we're going to roll the die, and if it's the same or lower than the initiative rating, and the initiative rating is 2, so we need a 0 or a 1 or a 2. 0, 1, or a 2, so 30% on this 10-sided die. Ah, we failed. Okay, alright, well we failed. So what that is going to mean is that the Spartan momentum marker is going to go back into the cup. Basically it means it'll get to be played after the normal Spartan chit, so I'm not even going to put it back in the cup. Which means the Spartans are going to get to go twice, and they know they're going to get to go twice. So, let me see. They're probably going to try to rally, but I need to check the rally rules here. Okay. Yeah, I think what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to rally. Now, unfortunately, actually, All right, I'm gonna take this off recording and think about it. Okay, so we're gonna wait to try to rally with the momentum marker, and we're gonna have the Spartans just go to town as they can. I think that's the best that we can do. Now, unfortunately, we have some command problems, so you can see while essentially our leader over here on the right is isolated. We can't quite get, because he's engaged, we have, maybe just enough to get over here. We really have limited ability to order anybody, so that means there's not going to be much movement. The units that are in place now are going to continue to have melee shock combat, but we're not going to be able to really do anything, and that calls into question the issue down here where this unit is a little bit isolated. It's certainly out of command, and that means I can't move. I mean, I can move, but I cannot move adjacent to an enemy unit. Now, I'm already adjacent to enemy units. I'm sort of behind that unit. And so I don't know if I can change facing this way. I think I might be able to. So we're going to have, I don't see any reason why I can't do this, but I'm going to have this unit reverse face for 4 movement points. Now, that does put this unit here in one of its front hexes, which means it can engage in combat. Now, that's not violating the rules. I didn't move to be adjacent to another unit while being out of command. I simply reversed face, and I believe that's legal, and there will be shock combat. But I think that means he's going to get a shock must check HQ, or TQ, which isn't necessarily the best idea here, but I don't think I have another option. So those are the movements. That's the best that I can do, I think, given the engagement processes we already have going on. So we're just going to go right into the shock phase with that, and so I guess I will check the attack here because we changed phase. So here we're going to do a TQ check. We got a 6, which I believe that's a pass. Okay, then that was successful. And because this is a new shock attack, this unit will actually have to make a check. So we'll roll for it. And roll to 0, so it's fine. And these guys will now be engaged thusly. I don't think these guys got a chance to do an emergency face change, and I believe that's because this unit didn't change the hex that it was in. If it had come into the hex behind it, it may have been able to get an emergency face. The critical thing is this unit's going to attack from behind, I think, is going to be really key to the problem here, I think. So, okay. I think that's it. I'm going to go through all of the shock rolls and then I will be back. So we'll see you there. Okay, so a lot of good rolls, more or less, for the Spartans, though their leader is still entangled, unfortunately. Just can't seem to beat that unit off, unfortunately. But otherwise, down the line, the fights are ongoing, but there's been some critical successes for the Spartans, and they've managed to rout a couple of Athenian units here on the right. And basically, the Athenians aren't going to get a chance to rally before we get to the end of the turn. And now, that was the Hoplite's activation marker, but they have their momentum marker. And I missed a rule earlier, so there was a point when the Athenians got their momentum marker, and I just treated that like an extra activation. You actually need to roll against your leader's initiative rating to succeed at getting to use your momentum marker, and the Athenians didn't do their roll. They got a free activation, and so just to be fair, I will let the Spartans get their momentum marker. I suspect this is going to be the last action of the game here. It's going to be this 2-turn battle because the rout amounts are just already so high. So I think what I want to have happen here is what I think is going to happen is enough units are going to be routing here that both sides are going to be beyond their rout scores, and it's going to be who has the least over their threshold that is going to win the fight. And I think for the Spartans, that means they need a rally. Now, unfortunately, the command structure is so blown to bits that the only unit that they really have that can possibly recover is this unit over here. And so I think what they're going to do is they're going to do a rally order, and basically what that means is no units are going to move, and then we're simply going to have the rally attempt for that unit that's currently routing, and then we will go to the shock combat, and the rest of these shock combats that are currently going on will resolve themselves, and if the Spartans are lucky, they will have won via that, but of course I think there's still a potential here that those die rolls are going to go badly, but fortunately for them, they're all one-on-one combats, and I think the edge for the attacker is going to mean that they can hold out on this one, so I think that's the way we're going to do it. So we're going to attempt to rally, so the one unit back there will get their attempt, and what we need to do is to rally a routed unit, the player rolls the die for each eligible unit. The die roll, if it's the same or lower than the formation commander's charisma, then the unit is rallied. So we're going to roll a die. We need a 0, 1, or a 2, and we just miss it. So unfortunately that unit does not rally, which is a shame, Okay, so what that means is that because this failed, this unit automatically is eliminated, taken off the board, and we're immediately going to put the route points on the scoreboard here. So that's not good for the Spartans. That's a shame. Basically, why they get instantly removed is because we attempted to call them back to the battlefield. They said no thanks, so they're just simply taken off the board, unfortunately. So much for that, and that just takes us immediately into the shock combat, and just right away, there's shock combat over here with the leader. Leader doesn't get wounded, straightforward stuff, and we're just going to go down the line here very quickly, and I'll resolve that. We'll be back right back when I'm done. Okay, so after that shock results, if we zoom in here on the left, we did finally get that Spartan leader to defeat the unit there out on the flank. In the middle, things still went clink against each other. No victory. And then finally, that one on the middle right here, or rather in the middle of the field, but the furthermost to the right of all the combats, the Spartans were able to roll well enough with the attacker advantage to send the Athenians flying. And so that's the end of that momentum activation, which means we are at the end of all the activations, and we go to the end phases of the turn. And so now we're going to take all the phalanx routed units that have been routing here, and we're going to add them to the route point totals, and we're going to end up checking for victory here. So I'm going to just go across the way here from left to right for the Athenians, and then I'll finish up for the Spartans. So we have 12 for this unit is removed. So add 12. Then this unit, which is another 12. This unit, another 12. This unit, another 12. This unit, that's another 12. So give me 1 second here. And then this is another 10. Yikes. Well, that leaves the Athenians at 81, which is way, way, way over. I wonder if maybe I've missed some rules along the way. I think it's entirely possible that I did. But the Athenians are way, way, way over their requirements, so it's really going to depend on the Spartans, and I feel like they're going to turn out just okay. So here, that's going to add 12. And then here, okay, I had to clear up some space on my SD card for recording here. So I removed all now the eliminated units that are on the map, and it just very interestingly was, so if I compared the end result, so the Spartan army withdraws when the units with the route points totaling at least 35. Well, at the end of all of this, they wound up with 36. But the Athenians route at, or withdraw rather, at 45, but they ended up grand total of 81 route points. And just that last, those last couple of activations just saw the Athenians just completely fall apart. I mean, they were about to win, honestly. And if they had managed to gain the momentum, or rather if they had trumped that momentum marker, or had been able to, or rather, yeah, okay. Had they trumped the Spartan counter, they probably would have won, because the Spartans would have routed at, would have had 36 route points. That would have been above their threshold, and they would have lost. The Athenians wouldn't have lost those units, and they would have been under their threshold, so the Athenians would have won, but they just couldn't, get that critical roll right, and the fighting continued, and the Spartans, because they were on the attacking side for the last couple of activations, they got that attacker advantage in combat, and the matchups for cohesion hits for the phalanxes, it just made it so that the Spartans could basically come out of that ahead, and the Athenians were attempting to pass die roll after die roll of not routing, and we just had all those Athenian units they were too tired to keep fighting. So if I look here, if both sides reach their withdrawal level at the end of the same turn, the player with the least number of route points above that level wins, but just barely. So this is a victory that goes to the Spartans and their allies, but only just barely. Only just barely. So I don't know. I think along the way I probably made some rules mistakes, and I'm sure if someone's really watching this video from beginning to end, probably could find some. I'm sure it happened. I probably made some moves that were not smart probably along the way. I think some of the whole thing with the flipping of the unit, while it was adjacent to opponents, while it was out of command, may have been a little gamey, but based on the rules, I don't think there was a problem with me doing that. Maybe somebody who's watching and is an expert, they could tell me. So I don't know. This was an interesting fight. I didn't think the Spartans would actually come away with the win here. The cavalry ended up not really mattering at all, which is kind of how the real battle went, I think. But yet the Spartans were able to win, so it went to historical victory. So interesting stuff. It was fun to play. The recording this and stopping recording and re-recording is kind of a pain in the butt. So it's a little difficult to get it so you guys get a consistent narrative here. But yeah, it was a lot of fun, and we'll look to do some more battles in this game and in the series in the future. So thanks for watching. Hit like if you liked it. Hit subscribe if you'd like to see more. See ya.